happy to do their adult version of show and tell. All of the people that are out here are very seasoned collectors. These are guys that wanted to collect guns, uniforms, memorabilia, insignia, everything down to currency, stamps, letters from home, you name it, these guys have it in their collection. This is an excuse for us to come out as an organized group, as historians, to actually share the history of World War I and tell what happened over 100 years ago on the fields of France. The American contingents that you have here and the British, they're getting into positions. And what you see here is a pretty typical field with distances of about 150 to 200 yards in between the positions, which was relatively close, but sometimes they were closer, sometimes they may have been further. Where the houses are, that tree line with the pines way off in the distance, that might be about as far as you would have been from the trenches. Also keep in mind this is a frontline trench. The frontline trenches were in depth, so there'd be a line, continuous line, from the English Channel 700 miles to the Swiss border. Then there would have been a second line, then a third line, then a fourth line, then a fifth line, all interconnecting with saps and things like that. And they were manned with groups that would come in and go into the reserve trenches, forward reserve trenches, into the main front lines for about a week, then rotate back out of the line, then rotate back through that process again. Because otherwise, if guys stayed in the trenches for any length of time, they would eventually break and crack, or they were more than happy to surrender, or they wouldn't return fire because they were shell-shocked. We're going to do a representation battle from about 1916, and we are going to show you what the fighting would have looked like between one small section of trench, between about one company versus one company of infantry. This is one little tiny section of a couple hundred yards of line. This battle would have been extrapolated over several miles long, along with artillery fire. So some of you may or may not know World War I started out in 1914 when the Archduke Ferdinand was shot by Serbians. They were nationalists that didn't want to be part of Austria-Hungary and part of that empire. So they actually fought a resistance movement, and they shot the heir to the throne. The Austro-Hungarians said, you know what? We want the Serbians to turn over the terrorists who killed our future leader. And they said, no, come and get us. So they did. They invaded Serbia. Serbia, little tiny Serbia, was a friend of Russia. They also have the same colors on their flags. They feel that there's a good Slavic bond between them. And they ended up having a big brother friend with Russia. Russia said, if you ever get invaded, we'll come to your aid. Well, the Russians, the Austro-Hungarians had a treaty with the Germans that if we ever get invaded by the Russians, we'll come to your aid and we'll fight against Russia. Russia had a treaty with France that if they ever got attacked by Germany, France would open a second front on them. The Germans thought the Russians are going to take a while to mobilize, so they ended up going and attacking through Belgium and to attack northern France and cut off the Channel ports and take Paris. It was a great plan, but they got bogged down because the British had a treaty dating back to the Napoleonic Wars that if little Belgium ever got invaded, the British would come to their aid because the British were going to sit this one out. But they got sucked in by treaty obligations, and they stopped the Germans enough to slow them down and stop them in northern France. And they were in a stalemate at that point, and all mobile warfare came to a halt by the fall of 1914. And it's set up where the front lines moved very little for 3 or 4 years. So they came up with innovations that we're going to show you today that I'll explain as we go through the battle. And the Germans, in the Allies on the other side of the field, there's sporadic fire that would erupt between the two different lines. And a lot of times they'd take pot shots, sometimes it was silent. But where you see guys' heads popping up and stuff like that, that actually was very rare to see on the front lines. Most of these guys would have been down. And when you take a tour of the trench and you look at this later, you'll see that these side trenches are very rudimentary and shallow, because that's what the Allied trenches looked like earlier in the war, because they were just digging in, so when the spring offensive came, we're going to roll over the Germans and we're going to wipe them out. The Germans realized that they needed a strong defensive line, so their trenches were much more better prepared, and much more in depth, and they dug their machine guns and that in. They also had trench artillery, trench mortars that they would bring up on the line. So the Germans, you'll see, they would try to do trench raids onto the other side of the field, and they are going to go try to take and penetrate the front lines so they could take part of the territory that they have. Once they could start infiltrating Allied trenches, they could actually push further in, and you want to straighten your line out so you don't have salients where these little bump outs are in the field, because that causes problems where they have an advantage if there's a big finger of enemy troops in their lines. So these guys are trying to straighten out one of those areas. So as they move forward, they form a skirmish line and they're pushing forward, probing the lines essentially to see how much resistance they get. And right now they're just getting rifle fire. The big puff of smoke you see on the west side of the field by the Germans, that's a trench mortar that's starting to fire and lay down close artillery support on the troops that are close by. The range on the trench mortar, the 75 millimeter trench mortar, was a couple hundred yards, up to maybe a mile. So we have the Vickers machine gun that's getting into service to lay down covering fire, prevent the enemy infantry from crossing that field. We have a sniper that's trying to take out individual soldiers that's in an elevated position. So as the Germans come across, the Americans, or the Allies at this point, kind of have any way of stopping them. We talked about new technologies, and one of the new technologies was the use of artillery poison gas. Poison gas was used for the first time by the Germans in 1915 and quickly adopted by all sides. The gas was mainly incapacitating because it could dissipate under any conditions, but it depends on which way the wind goes. So if the wind is always blowing into the German lines, it's pretty favorable for the Allies, which in Europe was the case most of the time. So they bogged down a little bit, but the Americans now have time, if they want, they can call support for artillery. You see that some gas rounds are landing in the field, and that poison gas, usually mustard gas, can burn your lungs, burn your eyes, cause permanent blindness in some cases. It also caused huge blisters to form all over the body. And when that happened and they broke open, it actually it spread all over to the rest of your body very easily. So it caused casualties that would take them out of the line, require them to go to a field hospital, and it would require treatment years after the war. The Veterans Administration in the United States was actually formed after World War I to care for the massive number of gas casualties caused in World War I. You can see the Germans are bogged down, they get their masks on, they're kind of stuck, and they realize that they're hitting heavier resistance than they thought they would. You may see that they may start to pull back because they realize that they're hitting a strong resistance, and it's kind of suicide to cross a large field like this, even if you have thousands of troops. The British thought if you had more troops in 1916 that they could just charge across the field in the Battle of the Somme, and that they could just take positions to run force with attacking with 100,000 troops in one sector. What they found is that the British Army had the single bloodiest day of its entire history, with over 40,000 casualties within one day. They continued that attack for several months moving forward, losing tens of thousands more. And this is a kind of an illustration of what the trench warfare looked like because things are bogged down. The poison gas was an attempt to try to maybe change that balance of power, but it quickly just became a horrible fact of life for all the soldiers involved, just making things even more miserable. A lot of times when you have an attack, though, the first thing you want to do is catch the enemy off balance. So these guys are pushing out from the Allied trenches to go onto the German trenches. They're trying to push these guys back and possibly take theirs. You catch them off balance because they just put casualties, they have a bunch of wounded in the front lines. The guys that are coming for a follow-up attack don't know what's going on. They lost some casualties on the field, so it's easy to knock people off balance very quickly. So that's the reason for a counterattack very swiftly after they get out. A lot of times an attacking force also doesn't expect to be attacked itself and being pushed back. So those guys are trying to go forward. But they're running into the same thing where they're running into accurate rifle fire, they're running into 08 Max, so heavy machine gun firing in on them. And they're running into the same problem that enlisted in 1914 when the lines formed, they were completely deforested within a couple weeks or months of the onset of the war because the artillery turned into a wasteland of stumps. Going back to the old days of like the Napoleonic era and earlier, they would try to build an esprit de corps. And you can see that the British, they have a piper. And the piper is kind of a holdover from an earlier warfare, dating back to the Napoleonic era, much earlier, where you had fife and drum corps to try to build an esprit de corps of the troops, keep the morale up as they're moving forward. Kind of like having a theme song. That was sort of the idea. So a second wave is going up. These are signal corps troops, and they're laying field phone wire, so if they are successful in their field attack, they can quickly set up communications. They can speak to their command posts further back on the lines, tell them whether they need reinforcements, water brought up, ammunition, etc. And also get the tags reports so they're not blind as to what's going on the other side of no man's land. You'll also see a basket that's attached to the one soldier's back. That's actually a set of pigeons. They were still using courier pigeons in World War I. All armies used them to where you could release a pigeon with a little pellet attached, and it would fly back to its roost, and it would home right in wherever its roost, where it came from. So it came back to the rest of the mess. They could collect the messages, and then they could have communication directly with the front lines via a small pigeon. The Americans, the Allies are also getting bogged down, but one of the innovations that they had was the advent of developing armored vehicles to be on the battlefield. 1914 was the first use of machine guns and heavy artillery, modern quick-fire artillery, with other European armies. And they realized that they needed some way to be more effective to overcome the accurate fire and the devastation. And you can see that they're bogging down and they're starting to pull back because they're realizing they're not going to advance and their guys are getting up. To break the stalemate, sometimes the French get the bad rap, but the French were actually the first to develop the use of steel helmets to protect the skulls and the heads of soldiers. And they also were the first to use tank. They developed the Schneider tank in 1916, and they used it for the first time with great effect. The British quickly followed suit, and the Americans, when they got there, were actually being supported in the Battle of Cantigny, the first involvement with the Americans standing on their own with a Schneider tank, and French assault infantry with flamethrowers when they did their first push on their own without being in direct support or subordinate to the British or the French forces. The Americans trained for several months when they went over to be under the French and the British who had actually been there for a long time. You'd think that the British training them, since they speak the same language, would actually make a lot of sense and that they would learn more. But the accents were so thick and the words and the verbiage that they used was so different that the French realized that there is a language barrier, and the French actually had a much better command of being able to train troops because they knew that they had to clearly translate everything.
Oh my god, the tank.
So you can see the Schneider tank that's moving up. When these things first appeared on the battlefield, they were often nicknamed land battleships. And these tanks were built on commercial tractors that they had in France that they had imported. And they built box chassis that would go over them.
What
so
a
they
beauty.
could have frontal armor, side armor, and they could move forward. And the idea was that they could have machine guns. You'll see two machine guns, one mounted on either side of the ball turrets.
Look at that
Those
beauty.
are hot air-cooled machine guns, and they are they can fire. They can get up to 500 degrees, and they can continue firing for long periods of time without overheating. Once they reach 500 degrees, they would just plateau out, and they could just keep feeding ammunition through it all day. They mounted on the side of the tanks because the idea was that you'd roll right up to the trench, and you would just start firing into the trench either direction on either side of the tank. It's also armed in the front with a snubby 75mm Blockhouse Schneider howitzer. The howitzer, the barrel on it's only about 3.5 feet long, and it fires a full-size artillery round, but it has a very small powder load. The idea wasn't to shoot an artillery shell 3 miles, it was meant to shoot it about 200 yards. So in the situation you see here, you see French supporting infantry moving forward, and they have a 75mm gun that they're trying to get into position, because you have to position the tank in such a way that it'll actually fire directly at the position, because if you turn the tank, it didn't have a turret, so you had to position the 75mm high velocity round had a pressure switch in the front, so when it hit a target, it would explode with high flow shrapnel. And the idea was that you take out the machine gun nets, which are the main killing machines, and you could also take out the areas of resistance and a trench line. You could start taking out that trench line systematically. These guys would start working. They had the one of the Schneiders on the side firing, and they had the infantry that's supporting them that's using the tank for cover. They're starting to move up on the Allied side, where they're going to counterattack using the tank as a strong point to move forward like a little pillbox. And this is the technology that started breaking the backbone of the Germans. The Germans developed anti-tank guns and anti-tank rifles to take out these tanks that were really heavy armor. But the tank was a major game changer on the battlefield. The Schneider was used a gasoline-powered engine, and sometimes they carried reserve tanks in the back of the Schneider. But if you got a direct hit with either a trench mortar round, anti-tank rifle, or from a cannon, a lot of times they would bring 77mm cannons and they flash them to take out tanks. And these things were usually lit up with Roman candles because they were gasoline fed. The machine gun on the German side was an 08 Maxim that's on a sled mount. It was designed for heavy sustained fire. It was a water-cooled gun, so it has a water cooling jacket, similar to the Victors you see in the field. And the cooling effort was to cool the barrel down enough to where the gun would be so hot that it was actually setting off the ammunition before it even got into the gun, because it was so hot. That's how they managed to keep the buildup of friction from the firearms in World War I. By World War II, they came up with a large array of air-cooled weapons that were much more efficient than because you don't have to carry water, you don't have to worry about your water jacket being punctured, and seals being broken from the dust when you're being carried around in the field. Taken out several spots along the main firing line. They're starting to roll out gaps for these guys to move forward. The tank is doing its job where they're actually moving up. They're signaling the infantry now to move forward to try to hit a gap that they've cleared out German infantry. And as they get into infiltrate the trench, they'll be able to get in through shell holes and things like that in the water and be able to clear out the Germans bunker by bunker. If you take a tour of the trench, you'll see on that side that it's not a straight line, it's zigzags. The reason for the zigzagging is that once you get heavy infantry into the trench, you don't just shoot down a line that's half a mile long. You only have like 20 yards at most, then you got to go to a zigzag. The Germans or the Americans or whoever would be sitting at that juncture to ambush anybody who comes around the corner, or the guys who have that trench. They know if they stand on the other side of a bunker or a firing position, they could throw grenades over, and they know the distances they have to throw to hit the grenades into the trench line that's being infiltrated.
We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here. We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here.